Hello and welcome to the channel for the Hamilton-Halton Construction Association Young Leaders Group. This video is part 2 of the 2020 YLG Talks Safety Edition, featuring Patrick Ganley. I'll pass it over to the YLG co-chair Christina Murray for introductions.
And then now we want to welcome Patrick to the screen here.
Hello all.
Good morning, Patrick, and I will take over.
Great. Hi everyone. Thanks for making the time this morning. Thanks for having me. Got a quick deck put together, so I will share that, and if it's not working, do let me know. I'm a lawyer at Sherrard Kuzz. We are management side labor and employment law firm representing employers. My practice is largely labor-based with a heavy emphasis on construction. And like all of us, we've been doing our best to keep up in the circumstances. Kevin and I were actually having a chat earlier regarding how quickly it's all changing. So, I mean, even by taking the step to pop on today and educate yourselves, you're taking a good step. Now, I think that should be my deck up there. Let's see, it's working. Brief overview. So in terms of the time we have today, I've packed a lot into the presentation in terms of items that I want to be on your radar. We covered the essential business order. I'll go through and have a look at that list as well. As many of you know, there was an update to that list. The original list, the update was updated on April 3rd and significantly narrowed. We'll talk that through. And then as of yesterday morning, we received indication that other businesses could open, and we've seen some expansion in the construction industry. So I'll certainly walk through that. Employment issues, I will move through. Just want them on the group's radar, in terms of practices, layoffs, terminations. In terms of the content of that section, probably more than we have a good deal of time for today. But again, if it's of assistance with issue spotting, I certainly want that on everybody's radar. Briefly cover government programs and subsidies, a few labor relations considerations. And as it's Health and Safety Week, we'll certainly be covering some occupational health and safety to pick up on Kevin's content. So in terms of the emergency orders itself, this is happening under the Emergency Management and Civil Protection Act. The government has authority to do this. It's not just picking on construction. They have very broad powers right now and can shut down basically anything they want to, anytime they want. We've seen this same legislation. It's the orders related to healthcare and long-term care homes, retirement homes are also being passed under this regulation. And it's 8220 is the regulation that is where the closures are actually listed. So I'm actually going to take a second. We'll go through. We received a revised list yesterday, and when we look at the list, which we'll do in a moment, we'll see that there's been significantly narrowed classifications. For instance, our first list on May 23rd, ICI and residential construction was good to continue. We received some comments following that March 23rd list along the lines of what is closing. There was a pretty broad list. It was an important first step, but that was significantly narrowed on April 3rd. And it's important to keep in mind the stated intent of the government. They narrowed this list for a reason. The idea is that some projects and some sites are going to shut down in accordance with this list. And we'll have to stomach that and roll with the punches as they come out. But there is a very intent focus on limiting things right now. Like I know after the March 23rd list came up, the government released that 1888 number, and we actually hopped on it and see who was on the other end when you called and got through. This is late March prior to the revised list, and the first position of the government appeared to be with the advisors on this 1888 line was, if you can fit yourself on the list, then you're permitted to stay open. Not much more guidance past that. And if you wanted more guidance, there was a tier 2 officer that called you back. But the initial focus of the government appeared to be, if you can fit yourself in the list, you can stay open. We see a significant change on April 3rd, which I'll go through the text of in a minute. But the government is limiting operations, and it is expected that some businesses will be reduced. I think we can see through the pressers and Premier Ford's comments that there is an aversion to opening too quickly. Just recent stats out of the United States, yesterday we saw approximately 40 states will be moving to limited restrictions or opening certain facilities and venues, and the models for deaths in the US basically doubled to 140,000 overnight. So there is governmental concern here anyhow about opening too quickly, and I think that's going to bleed into some of our provincial decision making. Positions of owners and general contractors, I'm sure that there have been a number of issues with this, but at first, you might want to discuss with your owner or GC what their expectations or desires are, and whether they'd be paying any fines levied if work continued improperly. But there's also, it's conversation that you should be having and very likely are having. Important in this content is, these are unprecedented times. There is a desire to certainly continue with productivity for a variety of reasons. But my caution to clients these days is hindsight on all this is going to be 2020. I think looking back, some of the decisions that will result from various provincial bodies, be it the Labor Board or the Ministry of Labor, looking back at all this, there's not going to be a lot of time or sympathy for decisions that were made on the basis of productivity as opposed to employee health and safety. There's a desire to keep things moving, and then, looking at the list, is it a stretch if I run that operation during these times? But there are risks to employees. As an employer, you have obligation to take every reasonable precaution to assist or to protect the health and safety of employees. And frankly, there are high risks out there these days. So yes, there's a desire to keep production moving, but looking back at it, if there was an infection on site and it was determined that it was contracted at the workplace, there are significant penalties, and I don't think a lot of sympathy. So it is a time to proceed with caution. And we also know that there are significant financial penalties that have been brought forward under the Emergency Management Act that I just mentioned. And these include up to $100,000 for an individual and up to a year of jail time, and for corporations up to a $10 million fine under that legislation. So yes, it's uncertain territory, but we'd certainly be wise to proceed cautiously in this new world, because while the regulations are changing quickly, our obligation to comply with them does not, and they've just raised the stakes on the back end from a penalties perspective. In terms of the list, I'm actually going to just pull that up quickly as we're all becoming more familiar with Zoom than we otherwise were. So here's the new list, and where we've seen a significant, we see narrowing in the list, words such as necessary or critical, in terms of other sections that were otherwise more broadly stated. So for instance, I want to take an example here. This is the previous maintenance, for instance. So this was maintenance section under the old list. This is the March 23rd list. Support maintenance services, maintain safety security, listing a number of trades. Fairly broad. You can fit a lot under that list. Whereas with the new list, if that's showing up here, bear with me. We see a significant narrowing, whereas the new maintenance definition, strictly necessary to manage and maintain the safety, security, and sanitation of essential operation. So there is a definite narrowing in this and many other sections. And then we did see the move earlier this week in construction. So here's our new construction list. And we have seen some expansion, which I can imagine have been of assistance to many of us. But to Kevin's point, the obligations under the Occupational Health and Safety Act generally are always there. And if anything, this is the time to be more focused on those than ever. In terms of the construction projects, this wasn't changed, healthcare sector related, safe and reliable operations and critical provincial infrastructure. This is a new one that was added on Friday and took effect yesterday. Support the safe operations or new capacity in colleges, universities, municipal infrastructure, critical industrial construction activities related to petrochemical. This one was added after April 3rd, and it's construction projects that are due to be completed on or before October 4th and that would provide additional capacity in the production, processing, manufacturing, and distribution of food. So this was obviously aimed at maintaining the supply of food and the food supply chain. But there's a good example here. We received a question from a client, well, I'm building a restaurant. So if I'm building a restaurant, is that not construction engaged at, at least distribution of food? And that's one where you're not going to get clear guidance from the government. You've got your list and you've got your project. In terms of that discussion there, you're looking to contextual factors. Yes, that restaurant will be distributing food, but that restaurant's not currently an essential business right now. And all of this in the gray area we're operating in, or to Kevin's point, 50 shades of gray, is we've got to figure it out. So it's a matter of risk tolerance, and I, if possible, certainly think we'd be wise to miss on the side of safety in the current climate. Residential project, this was unchanged. So we saw footing permit granted, structural permit, or renovations started before April 4th. And here we see a new one that has freed up quite a bit of sites as of yesterday morning. Construction to prepare a site for ICI or residential development, including any necessary grading, roads, or utilities, or infrastructure. So that, as compared to our April 3rd narrower list, we do have increased ability under the new list to open businesses, but and the focus on health and safety has to be paramount. I think we're back to the slides there. So under the order, there is temporary access permitted to a business, and that would be to comply with any applicable law, allow for inspections, maintenance, or repairs, security services, other matters related to closure of the business, if they cannot be attended to remotely, and access materials and supplies. So, one example of complying with applicable law would be the amount of time within which you have to issue an ROE if layoffs or terminations are taking place. But any of these access measures, have to be viewed through the lens of, are we taking all reasonable precautions? So, we had to issue ROEs. Did somebody have to go into the office, or were we able to do that remotely? And what steps did we take to try to do that remotely? So again, looking back on all this, if hindsight's 2020, we're already, imagining situations where there is contraction on a workplace, or alleged it was contracted in the workplace. The lens is immediately going to look back to the employer to say, what did you do? And the answer that, oh, well, we really needed to get that bid submitted for that project, or we really needed to get this piece of a mandate done, is not going to be an acceptable answer, I don't think, unless you have policies and procedures in place, to Kevin's point. So every step of the way, what steps are we taking to A, comply with our obligations to protect employees, but B, protect the business in the process? So in terms of employment considerations, again, to Kevin's point, we are, in terms of people in the industry, just trying to keep up with regulations right now. So one example is, Kevin mentioned the phone ringing off the hook, and March was absolutely nuts. It was I like the hotline example. It's, what do we do? We're massively reducing our workforce. We need to implement layoffs or terminations. And then a week later, they announced the wage subsidy, and we're getting calls to bring all the same employees back. So everybody's trying to keep up right now, but there's great resources that I'm going to point us to, both distributed by my firm on our homepage of our website, has FAQs for employers, which were updated briefly and is now over 20 pages, but has a large number of frequently asked questions, and also a specific FAQ for unionized employers in the construction industry that do provide some great guidance. And the MOL released last week guidance specific to sectors, which I will show the lane through as well. So in terms of what we're doing in response, and this list is certainly not the be all and end all, but temporary reductions in hours, rates of pay, we're all trying to weather the storm. We've seen this across industries, and if a rate of pay or a number of hours were reduced, this could still lead to more than an employee would be entitled to under the EI system, which has now been floated into the CERB system, which we probably heard of. But a temporary reduction in rates of pay or hours could provide the employee with more than they would be receiving through EI or the CERB. With a unilateral reduction in hours or rates of pay, there is a risk of constructive dismissal. That's basically saying, taking the position that my employer has unilaterally changed my terms and conditions such that I've been effectively dismissed. We haven't seen a ton of those filed in response to reduction of hours or work, but it is a risk. We've also seen articles in Financial Post and other publications recently regarding some plaintiff side lawyers pointing out, whether there is even a right to lay off an employee if it's not stated in a contract. That has caused certainly a little bit of confusion, but I do wonder whether those plaintiff side counsel, who in essence would be advising employees to quit and sue their employer in a very tough job market, I wonder whether those counsel would be providing employees any assistance with their mortgage in the event they did choose to quit and sue in the circumstances. In terms of reduction to a skeleton crew, so within an office, can you permit telework? You're still paying people, but they're working from home, hopefully. If people are coming into the office, be it, everyone needs, or not everybody, certain people need to be in to complete a bid or get certain information. Are we doing it with the fewest amount of people possible? And are reasonable protections in place for those people? Complete office closure could be possible. It's actually been mandated in some instances, but consider the slide above regarding temporary access. And we want to be able to, in the event anything occurred, point to a list of measures that we took as an employer to protect the health and safety of people doing work for us during this time. Employees using vacation or lieu time, to the extent that you can provide, paying out that vacation or lieu time in advance of a layoff could also be of assistance. And many of us, just in terms of our timelines, may have heard the distinction between a 13-week and a 35-week and what impact that has. In essence, a layoff is temporary under the Employment Standards Act until it's for a period of greater than 13 weeks, at which point it becomes a deemed termination. This 13-week can be extended to 35 weeks, so a temporary layoff period of 35 weeks, if certain payments are made to the employee during that time, which can include benefit continuation or access to a sub-plan. That temporary term layoff period can be extended out to 35 weeks. And the upside to that for many employers is, in essence, once the deemed termination takes effect, an employee is entitled to notice and severance obligations under the Employment Standards Act. Now, many of us know that construction employees or employees actively engaged in construction are actually exempt from notice and severance under the Employment Standards Act. But they do still have a right, they could potentially sue outside of the statute for common law. So there is value in extending this period of temporary layoff, but really it's math. If the group of employees isn't going to be entitled to severance or notice under the ESA, maybe there's some efficiency in not continuing it, but it's an operational decision that should be made in conjunction with advisors, to the extent that you're just planning, okay, what are my benefit costs for carrying if I know I'm going to bring the employee back, versus what the cost of the termination entitlement would be if that's triggered. So on termination, again, this is the importance of employment contracts I cover briefly. There's this notion, or under the Employment Standards Act law rather, that your rough rule of thumb on termination. So this would, let's take for instance an office employee, maybe somebody in accounts payable or an office manager, somebody not directly connected to the work at the site who wouldn't be exempt from notice and severance. The importance of employment contract can limit an employee to statutory minimums. So that is 1 week per year of service to a maximum of 8 weeks. And then if the employer is a large employer, has a payroll over 2.5 million and the employee's been there for over 5 weeks, there's an additional severance entitlement to 1 week per year of service to a max of 26 weeks. Whereas if an employee chooses to sue at common law, which is a different stream, the rough rule of thumb is 1 month per year of service. So a valid employment contract can be a great protection measure for a business in any climate, COVID-19 or other, in terms of getting a cap on or controlling what a termination entitlement might be. Again, the exception for construction employees who are not entitled to notice or severance. covered this. So that's the common law reasonable notice. Again, the value of a contract ties an employee to the employment standards minimum, as opposed to having the ability to go and get common law notice or attempt to. In these circumstances, the offer is, if you're in a situation where you're terminating employees, we've actually seen a small increase in that through the current pandemic. There were a number of employers across industries that had terminations, without cause terminations planned for a while, just hadn't, had the impetus to move forward with it, and this provided that. So some employers reorganizing house a little bit right now. And in those circumstances, if there's an absence of an employment contract, you want to consider contacting counsel to, if you offer more than the employment standards minimum, you can get a release signed, which could also protect the organization moving forward. Cover ROEs briefly. We receive a number of questions on these. Now timing, so 5 calendar days by law. But for those of us in a collective bargaining, operating under collective agreement, be sure to check our collective agreement for obligations and timelines. And I'll cover this in the labor relations sections, but yeah, all of the information you're seeing online, be it, FAQs on our site or the Ministry of Labor information, is all information based on legislation and guidelines, which can certainly be modified by a collective agreement. So to the extent we're bound to any collective agreements, it's certainly a good time to be familiar with issues such as layoff and timing of ROEs. Reason codes for ROEs. We do know that the mid-March, actually, the government identified self-isolation or quarantine as a valid ground for the illness or injury sickness benefit. The government eliminated the 1-week waiting period for this, for access to this benefit. It's currently unclear whether they're going to be eliminating the waiting period for shortage of work, but that waiting period does still exist. But in essence, let's say an employee returned from international travel, they are not able to return to work because they're under mandatory self-isolation. The government will now, through the EI process, which is being funneled into CERB, provide access to the illness and injury benefit for self-isolation. Layoff code for shortage of work, code A, M for dismissal. And, we're going to talk about work refusals, but Kevin alluded to it as well. There are situations where, the employee just has a general fear. I take public transit, COVID's out there, I'm not coming to work. We'll talk through how to address those. But, the idea that COVID's outside, so I can't be, is not necessarily going to be a valid ground for refusing to work. We'll go through the work refusal process in terms of explaining to the employee what measures you have in place. But if they're not coming to work and they're not sick or not self-isolating, we do have other options in the ROE in terms of E-quit or N leave of absence before making a determination that somebody has in fact quit. Particularly given the hindsight on all this, you would be wise to discuss that with an advisor before taking that position in the circumstances. I include this information in the slides, and I can distribute my deck afterwards through Christina if that works. Briefly, government programs. So the CERB, we know that as of April 15th, March 15th, all EI applications were actually funneled into the CERB program. Part of that was to relieve strain on the EI system, but it also provided access to these benefits for employees that might have not otherwise had such coverage. And we've all heard the stats about the number of applications. I think, late March, we saw almost 1 million going in. So that's certainly a busy time for Service Canada. Wage subsidies, I'll start this with a brief disclaimer. Labor lawyer, not an accountant, but these are the rough outlines of it in terms of what's available to an employer. Also good resources on our website in that regard, which also include various forms of tax deferral, including HST that an employer could look into. But there's 2 wage subsidies currently available. You can't get both of them, but you can get one or the other. And for the first one, it's the temporary wage subsidy. That's for smaller employers, smaller and medium-sized employers with defined as taxable capital under 15 million. But it's for everybody who's small or medium. You don't need a revenue drop. You could actually technically have a revenue increase and still be entitled to this benefit or this subsidy. and that is a 10% subsidy for all employers over 3 months to a maximum of $25,000. So not as big of a form of assistance as the CEWS, which I'll discuss in a moment, but certainly access to some assistance, and that's compensated through reductions in the amount you actually remit to the CRA. The CEWS, we've heard a lot about over the last couple of weeks, including a frustrating period where Prime Minister Trudeau and Finance Minister Bill Morneau were talking a lot about it, but they hadn't given the Lords any legislation. So we were having conversations with folks saying, we know what you do. We do have more guidance on that now, and there's some actually a very user-friendly website portal for it now. But this is revenue, basically it's wage coverage for up to 75% of a $58,000 salary. So the metrics for applying for this subsidy have changed after some feedback from the business community. Now you can compare your March or April periods to either March or April in 2019 or an average of January and February from 2020. And that was aimed at new employers that were growing to get them access to that first entitlement or that first entitlement period. And again, that's coming out to a maximum of $847 per week. So now in that first qualification period in March, employers were able to qualify if there was a 15% reduction. However, for the other two qualification periods, and they have just announced an extension of this, it's going to be having to show a 30% drop either year over year as compared to January and February. Labor relations considerations for those operating with collective agreements. So to my earlier point, review your collective agreements. You're going to want to make sure what's in them. Again, Service Canada may require a ROE in 5 days, but your collective agreement could have different considerations. It's going to have information on timing of layoffs, final pay, records of employments. So just be aware of the content from your collective agreement. Recall from layoffs. We've seen some employers in the industry with the agreement of their union going around hiring provisions and hiring hall provisions, in essence stating that anybody who went on a leave due to COVID-19 could be recalled directly as opposed to having to go back through the hall. Certainly going to want to discuss that with the union or your employer association. And in terms of what mechanisms we have under a collective agreement to address shortage of workers, there are instances where there's an overlap in jurisdiction with other unions. To the extent that one union was more able to provide than the other, do we go that route, even if the work was traditionally sent to the first union? And that's another risk analysis in terms of what kind of jurisdictional disputes are we looking to get into, how badly do we need the work. Also review our ability to subcontract. So I know Kevin touched on a lot of it, so I'll cover this at a fairly high level. And again, my slides will be available after the presentation. But be ready, guys. We are seeing an increase in the inspections from the Ministry of Labor. As Kevin noted, the number of inspectors and their mandates have been expanded. All of the duties and of an employer are in the Occupational Health and Safety Act and the regulation. That's the list of the regulation there is worth it for a riveting read, but some updates we've seen, and I think Kevin makes a great point in terms of the Green Book never went away. So we certainly want to be mindful of our obligations as we always are, but we're seeing obligation to provide facilities, including toilets and hand washing stations, and obligations to provide potable drinking water. Rough outline on what's happening around toilets and facilities. The constructor is responsible for facilities. It's the employer that has the obligation to take every reasonable precaution to protect the health and safety of employees. And in terms of the sanitation stations inspection, supervisors are expected to look at that at least once a week. But in terms of sanitation and porta potties, that's the Act's going to tell you that's as often as reasonably necessary. The Act lays out one toilet for every 10 or 15 workers and goes up, and when you get 30 to 45. 15 to 30, you're going to want a second toilet. One cleanup facility for every 2 toilets. So wash basin with running water, soap or hand cleanser, paper towels or hand dryer. And this is all riveting information I'm sure we're just loving on a Tuesday morning, but just to cover it, you want to include a toilet with a lid, toilet paper holder, providing privacy and protection from weather and from falling objects. And this is all out of the regulation. It should be illuminated, heated, and ventilated, and serviced, cleaned, and sanitized as often as reasonably necessary, with the constructor keeping a record of that. Supply of drinking water, piping system, or clean covered container. And I would hope, needless to say, we're not asking workers to share cups in the current circumstances. So what steps can we take to address COVID-19? And I'm gonna take us through, I am sensitive of the time, I'm gonna take us through just how to access the Ministry of Labor documents briefly. But stagger starts and end times, breaks and lunch. You know, you think about the government guidelines, the idea is we don't want groups of people together. So does that involve breaking up a toolbox talk? Posting signs about the importance of physical distancing. Thank you, Kevin. Thank you for the update on my terminology. Changes the toolbox and safety talks. Limit the number of workers on a hoist or on a site. Removing a coffee truck or staggered deliveries. All aimed at this notion that physical distancing is now the norm. So how are we addressing that on our workplace? Do we have a policy in place that addresses this? So we've also talked about screening, which I can address in the Q&A section, which is a step that some employers are taking, both for their employees as well as visitors to site, if those are permitted. So Kevin alluded to this in terms of working 6 feet apart. Their physical distancing is the government guideline. There's no government directive that mandates that employers remain 6 feet apart on a job site. But again, let's look through that lens of hindsight's 2020, when in the event something happened on site, the lens is going to go immediately back to the employer to say, what did you do? So whether that's providing PPE for people who may be working closer together, or taking steps to sanitize tools, if it's a journeyman and 2 apprentices, or are we trying to accomplish it with 1 apprentice? These are all the important steps we're going to be taking. And I'll just take a brief opportunity to show the Ministry of Labor documents. So here we see Ontario's construction site health and safety for COVID-19. And this has got, let me just see here. Right, so this was released last week, and these are resources to prevent the spread of COVID-19 in the workplace. It was released by sector. So we see construction, food processing, restaurant, and then within the construction sector, poster. Kevin mentioned the importance of posting this stuff. Every step that can be taken that an employer can later point back to say, I took all reasonable precautions, will be helpful. And here's a guidance note for the construction sector that was initially released on March 27th and has since been updated, covers best practices. In essence, in a lot of ways, this is a solid framework for a policy that Kevin mentioned would be expected of inspectors. So certainly some good information to access if you haven't already looked at it. And just while I'm here, before I go back to the slideshow, this is the homepage of our website. You can see here we're constantly updating there's our COVID-19 notice. FAQs for employers updated as often as is required, and there's information on there for construction employers as well. All right. Screening briefly. So we've seen forms distributed that some employers in the construction industry are having employees complete every day. And these can include questions, have you had or been in close contact with somebody with flu-like symptoms, traveled outside Canada, been on a cruise ship? And if the answer to these questions are yes, you can deny access to a work site. The other questions you might want to consider, the symptoms, and there's a number of resources from Telehealth Ontario, including cough, fever, respiratory issues. These are the types of things you want to be screening for. And when we get into Q&A, I can touch a bit on the temperature screening piece as well. So work refusals, Kevin also touched on this, so I will just unpack these charts briefly. But in essence, and many of you may have seen the Toronto Star article last week by a reporter who noted, as of last week, there were 213 work refusals filed in the province, and the report indicated that not one of them was upheld. There was a pretty nasty spin put on that, but this is the process that is followed in that circumstance. So the worker considers something unsafe, and there's a spectrum here, right? I don't want to get on the public transit to get to work because I might catch it, versus you're asking me to get in a trench with somebody who's been coughing for 2 days. I'm not doing that. And there's going to be a variety of responses based on the issue. But that worker reports it, then they get together, and this is the step where the employer speaks with the employee about the measures they have in place for protection, and the steps they're taking to make sure that the employee is in a safe space. And at that point, the worker either feels safe to go back to work or still refuses. At that point, the employer or the worker has the option to contact the Ministry of Labor. These are the complaints that I had mentioned. The article said there were 213 and none of them were upheld. But this will involve the ministry attending at the site, or to Kevin's point, contacting. I believe some are doing them over the phone now. But in essence, the matter is investigated and decisions issued. And either changes are made to the work, or it's determined that there was not a bona fide, risk of physical harm at the site. And at that point, if the ministry says you can go back to work and the employee still refuses, that once the ministry has issued that guidance, there are options from a discipline or termination perspective. Other options include assigning other worker the work. However, we do want to advise that worker of the first work refusal. Any questions on any of this? I will share my contact information as well as the slide deck. But I just, a couple high-level points in closing here. In terms of Are You Essential, I note be on the right side of history. Again, I am increasingly concerned about some of the decisions that come out of this in terms of the lens through which employers are viewed. All of us now trying to keep up with regulations and stay on top of it as best as possible. But how hectic these times, I think, will be often forgotten when decision makers are coming down on employers in the event that they weren't following things, or pushed the limits on the essential list a bit. Be there to support your employees. Consider office operations, how you can limit those or make those safer, and just be in touch with folks. It's amazing over the last month. You realize the importance of human connections, and being in touch with employees to check in on them can certainly be of assistance in that regard as well. So here's my contact information. I'm going to pop over now to questions to see. I think a few of them might have come in, and also here are the links to the FAQs on the Sherrard Kuzz website. Okay. So just I want to address temperature screening quickly. I think Kevin hit the nail on the head in terms of, are they reliable? And that should not be the only method that you're using to screen employees. One piece that Kevin particularly nailed is obviously the importance of a policy. If we're taking these steps, we want to be able to point to our policy to say we're taking these steps in compliance with our policy. And some of the best practices on temperature screening would include advance notice of the test, just so employees aren't stepping into it one day, maintaining privacy. The individual performing the test, should, if possible, be using a touchless temperature thermometer and should be trained in how to use it. Determine the threshold for the temperature in advance, right? So we're not, that would be in the policy, i.e. if it's over the 38.2 or 100 degrees, that if the policy states is a reason for refusing the worker to a site. And I think the question was received, if they fail the temperature test, can I ask them to leave the site? And to Kevin's point, this should be one of a number of measures, but that comes back down to risk tolerance, right? So, if the workers passed all the other screening, it could be more possible to get on site than otherwise. But again, with hindsight 2020, just want to think about how that would be viewed after the fact, and keep the results private. So that's, it's not necessary to do that screening, but certainly can put some best practices in place. And if, in terms of putting that in place, if you'd like any assistance with that, Kevin and I would be happy to help. So I'm just looking through other questions here.
There are questions there, Patrick. Do you want me to give them to you? Or you want to just read them?
So our company is back to work at an improved construction site. Should we maintain a reduced office staff? Obviously, we need to do what we need to do to keep it running. But again, looking back in hindsight, if people are at the office, you know, it is the office of an essential business performing an essential business activity. But again, if that office is open, did we explore telework? Did we put everything in the office? We need hand sanitizer, appropriate sanitation materials. Do we have a policy in place? Did we take the steps to make sure, you know, we're not meeting in groups of 5 or more in close distances in the office? And I just look at that as, you know, tipping the scale. Like, that is an office of a company performing an essential business. But in the event something happened after the fact, what can we point to say that we took all reasonable precautions in the circumstances? Is it reasonable to refuse work if there are screening measures in place that you feel violate your privacy? So on this, the Human Rights Tribunal hasn't had the ability or the opportunity to come down on where temperature screening would fall in terms of whether it's a violation of privacy or human rights. But if, and I want to make sure I'm getting the question correctly, if it's reasonable to refuse work. So if somebody doesn't want to take the test, and the test is a qualifier to get on site, then as per the policy, that employee would not be able to permitted to be on site. And there might be pushback on that, but in the course of the next weeks and months, we're going to get a lot of questions and see decisions where basically we're being asked to weigh, you know, convenience or productivity versus safety. And there could be some fallout from picking the safety option, i.e. you don't take the test, you don't come on site. And frankly, we don't know exactly what that fallout is going to look like, but it's, you know, basically on which side do you want to err? It could be that worker later files a complaint, but if the guy's temperature's through the roof, the risk analysis involves, am I letting this guy on site to potentially infect other workers if he's sick? So there's a lot of employers that would rather deal with the back end complaint from the employee than potential liability of infecting people on site.
Thank you so much, Patrick. I think those were there was some really timely information. I think there's one more question came in, and we'll wrap it up after you answer that one. Do you see it there?
If an employee does have a fever for a day and feels fine on the next day, how long should they stay off site? We were actually bouncing this around on a lawyer's call yesterday. So it depends. We know best practice. We've seen some government directives from provincial health authorities stating that it's to be 14 days. You're to self-isolate from 14 days of the last symptom, i.e. cough on Monday, fever on Wednesday, 14 days from Wednesday. There's other provincial health authorities suggesting that, you know, if you're symptom-free for 72 hours, you're fine to head out. We don't have a clear direction on that right now. Again, this is risk balance, risk tolerance. The individuals we spoke with yesterday, you know, considering the needs of the operation, just decided that it's going to be 14 days. That's the safest option in the circumstances. But there's no hard and fast rule on that. We've seen everything from 3 days to 14 days from the sign of last symptom. And again, that's when you're putting your thinking cap on to do a risk analysis for the business. And, you know, please feel free to reach out to someone like myself or Kevin should you need assistance with that.
Thank you guys both, Kevin and Patrick. We really appreciate you guys coming out this morning, and everyone, all of our guests for joining us. We really found this to be a timely discussion, and it's all on the top of our minds. So we really appreciate everyone being here. Just before we head out, I really wanted to thank all of our sponsors. We have a great support system to make these talks possible. So we have Simpson Wiggle Law, we have MTE Environmental, Aeron group of companies, Budget Demolition, Bessling Mechanical, and the Guarantee Group. So I want to thank everyone. If you guys see those guys around, thank them for supporting our YLG Talks and our YLG overall, I guess. And anyway, got any more questions for Kevin or Patrick, please feel free to reach out to them. And if you want a copy of Patrick's slide deck, please let us know and we'll get it out to you. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day.
Thank you, Christina.
No problem.
Thanks so much for watching. If you haven't already, be sure to check out the channel for part 1 of the YLG Talks Safety Edition. In part 1, former MOL Inspector Kevin Brown helps navigate work, site, health, and safety in the era of COVID-19. Hope to talk to you soon.